The French and Indian War, here we are. The French versus the Indians in North America. The French versus the British and the Indians. The Indians versus the French and the British against the American. The Indians and the Americans against the French. No, that's not right. The French and the Indians against the British and the Indian. No. Yeah? No. The French and Indian War. We'll figure out who fights in it after the intro. Alright, so that was just kind of a joke. Obviously we know who fights in the French and Indian War, and we're going to share that information with you here, but the first thing you need to know about the French and Indian War is that it was actually one conflict that was part of a bigger war that was going on between France and England all over the world. They were fighting in the Americas, they were fighting in Europe, they were fighting in Africa, they were fighting in Asia. Pretty much if there was a continent, they were fighting in it, except for Australia and Antarctica. And this was part of what is known in history as the 7 Years' War. But the French and Indian War is the conflict between the French and the British over their claims here in the New World. If you remember all the way back to like episode 2 maybe, episode 3, maybe it was episode 1, I'm not sure. We'll link to it in the cards over here. If you'll remember, we talked about the different claims that the different countries made as they were exploring the new continents of North and South America. The English are following all the claims made by John Cabot, whereas the French are following the claims made by guys like Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and who's the other guy? Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and Pierre? No, not Pierre. Golly, why can't I remember his name? Duh. I literally cannot remember the other guy. If you remember, hit us up in the comments. Who is that third French explorer that we talked about? All right, good save. So both countries had claimed similar parts of North America. The English were up around Hudson Bay in northern Canada. The French were mostly focused along the St. Lawrence River in the eastern central part of Canada. The French heavily were involved in the Great Lakes region. And then also, if you remember, the French claimed down the Mississippi River Valley as well. And so what you have is in North America, you have the French are expanding their influence south, and you have the English colonies that are expanding their influence west, and eventually they're gonna meet. And both of these frontier claims meet in the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley we'll talk about here in a little bit, but it was an incredibly desirable piece of land for both nations as they sought to colonize in North America. Now it's important to remember too, the different ways that both of these nations colonized. All right, England is setting up actual colonies, they're setting up cities, and these cities continue to grow out as more and more settlers come to North America in order to colonize. Whereas the French are not necessarily establishing major cities. Like they have Quebec, they have Montreal, all right, they have other settlements that are growing. However, most of the French settlement is done by fur trappers and traders seeking to make money off of the lucrative fur trading industry that's developed here in North America and is very popular back in Europe. Then you have your third party that we also have to consider. Actually, it's not even a third party. It's like a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, because there's lots of different tribes. The third party to consider here in this whole conflict are the Native Americans. Now think about it. If you're a Native American living anywhere west of the frontier, living anywhere near the Great Lakes region, which group of Europeans do you prefer? Chances are you're probably going to prefer the French because they're not looking to take your land and establish these huge settlements. They're mostly looking to work with you and trying to profit off of the fur trade industry in that area. So the French and the Indians had a few different relationships already. So like I said, both of these nations begin to meet in the Ohio River Valley, and this is where you get a few different conflicts that involve settlers, it involves Indian tribes, it involves the military of both countries, and in order to properly do the French and Indian War justice, we have a new segment here on U.S. History with Mr. Peterson, and we are going to go to the chart. So let's take it to the chart.
All right, here we are at the chart, and we're going to look at the advantages and the disadvantages that both the British and the French have here going into this conflict that will become known as the French and Indian War. Let's start off with the British, and let's start off with their advantages. As you can see, the British had 15 times the population in the British colonies as opposed to the French settlers in New France. There's obviously not as many of these French settlers because many of them are not looking to settle. They're involved in the fur trade industry. Also, we see the British are allied with the Iroquois Confederacy, which is the strongest group of Native Americans in North America. To top it all off, the British have the strongest navy in the world, which they will also use eventually in the French and Indian War to set up somewhat of a military blockade along the St. Lawrence River. Now let's go ahead and roll into some of the advantages that the French have. The French have a way more unified government. There was only one French colony in North America, and that was called New France. And New France was united underneath French rule. Everybody in New France, for the most part, was on the same page. They also have forts at key points in the Ohio River Valley. This would prove very helpful as they're looking to defend points in this region. Finally, they have supports from natives who prefer French over English. Also, these natives realized that as long as the French and the English were fighting, they weren't taking land from the natives, so they supported the French in their effort against the English in the French and Indian War. Now let's go ahead and move at the disadvantages of both of these sides. The British had some disadvantages. Here they are. The first one was the lack of colonial unity. Pretty much every colony existed independent from the other colonies around it. They were all British citizens, they were all British subjects, but they all had very different ideas of how their colonies should interact with one another. Also, there was a lack of colonial interest about the frontier. Why should someone living in Rhode Island care about people moving into the frontier and finding and having conflict with Indians or with the French or whatever? I mean, that's the whole reason why you don't move to the frontier in their mind. It was really hard to get people in like coastal Georgia cities like Savannah, for example, to really care about what was happening to other colonists far to the north and west of them in places that they probably would say they shouldn't be anyway. So these were the British disadvantages. France had some disadvantages as well. Here they are. New France was a large territory with a sparse population, making it very hard to defend. They don't have very many settlements. Pretty much the only thing they have going for them are the forts and then the different French settlers that are allied with the many Native Americans that live there. Obviously, they would send French troops into the region to help fight against the British and against the American colonists. But for the most part, this was a very difficult place to defend. So there you have it, the different advantages and disadvantages going into the French and Indian War. Now let's take it back to the video so you can hear more about this conflict.
All right, so now that we're aware of the French advantages and disadvantages and the British advantages and disadvantages, let's look at how this conflict got started. Now, before we even looked at the chart, we talked about the Ohio River Valley as the center of conflict between the French settlers and the British settlers. The Ohio River is one of the main tributaries to the Mississippi, and the valley that it flows through is incredibly lush, has lots of great places for farming, and has lots of great places for hunting and trapping the types of animals that are used in the fur trade. So obviously both parties are super interested in it. And then you have the people who are already living in it, the Native Americans, that are super interested in keeping their way of life as close to normal as possible. So the British look for a way to counteract the French advances in this region, and they begin to build a fort at a key point that forms the Ohio River. Now, while they're building this fort, the French say, hey, that's a pretty nice fort you're building there. It'd be a shame if somebody took it from you and built it and claimed it as their own fort. The British said, yeah, I would. Oh no. Is that what you're doing? And the French come on in and take over the fort from the British, and they build it up, and they name it Fort Duquesne. The area in which this fort is seized from the British technically falls under the jurisdiction of the colony of Virginia. So the governor of Virginia decides that he's going to send a force there to deal with the French who have taken this fort away from the British. And he sends 22-year-old George Washington with a small troop up to Fort Duquesne in order to take it back from the French by any means necessary. While en route to Fort Duquesne, Washington and his troops actually come across a French party, and they attack this group of Frenchmen and they defeat them, which was all good and well for Washington and the troops, but it also kind of sparked a bigger conflict. This becomes a bit of a problem though, because the French troops at Fort Duquesne hear about George Washington and his attack on this French party, and they send more troops after Washington. Washington, hearing that the French troops are coming out to get him and his troops, settles back into the woods of the region and hastily constructs what he calls Fort Necessity, which, I mean, it was necessary for him to build a fort, but it was probably more like a tree fort than an actual fort. It also didn't help that he built it in like the middle of a plain region with a bunch of trees surrounding it. Well, anyways, the French arrive at Fort Necessity, and after a short battle, Washington and his troops are captured, many of them killed, and Washington travels back to Virginia with the news that they had been defeated a second time at Fort Duquesne. And this all happens in the year 1754, which is the date that we look at as the start of the French and Indian War here in North America. So George Washington may be remembered today as one of the greatest Americans in history, probably the greatest American in history. However, his early career started off as kind of a flop. You saw here he gets his hiney handed to him at old Fort Duquesne. Really, the first few years of the French and Indian War see the French taking over spot after spot along with the help from the Indians in that region. And they take over lots of land that has been claimed by the British colonies and build forts, and they continue to strengthen their position there. Really looks like the French are going to win in North America. The French are also successful because they adopt the Indian style of fighting, which we would call today guerrilla warfare. Now, this isn't as exciting as it may sound because it does not involve any actual guerrillas. What it does involve is guerrilla warfare, Guerrilla, not Gorilla. That would be so much cooler. And guerrilla warfare uses small parties to attack and surprise and ambush larger troops in hopes of quickly inflicting as much damage as possible. The British aren't prepared for this. They are used to fighting in a more continental style back in Europe that involves two large groups of armies marching at each other and shooting at each other, and then we just kind of see who's standing at the end of it. The Indians are very confused that the British don't fight this way, and they are easily able to defeat them. Like, oh, they're just gonna stand there in their brightly red coats and not hide. Okay, well, here we go. So this guerrilla warfare that the Indians and their French allies practiced at this time is incredibly detrimental to the British. But it's during this early period of the French-Indian War that we see the colonies seek to do something for themselves. Benjamin Franklin calls on all of the 13 British colonies to send delegates to Albany, New York. And here at Albany, the different delegates from the colonies, except for Georgia, they weren't invited, and also some representatives of the Iroquois Confederacy, meet to discuss unifying together in order to fight against the French incursions. This is called the Albany Plan of Union, and this is where we get one of the most famous political cartoons in American history, the chopped up snake thing that you're looking at here. But basically the idea was this: in order to defeat any foreign enemies, the colonies are going to have to join together and fight. Now, the Albany Plan of Union fell apart as soon as Benjamin Franklin talked about the taxes that it would take on the different colonies, and the colonies weren't interested in losing that type of autonomy. But he got the ball rolling in this conversation, which sounds very familiar to a few years later when all of the colonies seek to unite against a common enemy. You may have heard of that. We'll talk about that in a couple episodes for sure. So with the French running roughshod all over the Ohio River Valley, with the colonies not unifying and fighting together, we see here the British decide that it's time to send in the big guns. So they send in their best general to North America to fight against the French. His name is Edward Braddock. And Edward Braddock gets to the North American colonies and he says, how are we going to get to Fort Duquesne? They tell him it's over there. He says, all right, we're going to build a giant road to get there. So Braddock takes months constructing this road to carry troops and equipment from the east part of the colonies off into the frontier to fight at Fort Duquesne. He builds his road, he gets to Fort Duquesne, he fights against them. Not only does he lose the battle at Fort Duquesne, he also gets mortally wounded and he dies eventually. George Washington, his assistant, is there watching this whole thing play out, and really Edward Braddock's career as a general here in North America went pretty poorly, and the British and their colonists are no closer to defeating the French. So at this point, something has to be done. There is no progress being made in North America, and the British take drastic actions, and they call on this lady. Okay, not a lady, that is actually a man, and his name is William Pitt, and he becomes the leader of the war effort all around the world against the French. And so obviously he's in charge of the war effort here in North America. William Pitt was a bit controversial, but he was very effective. And the reason why he was controversial was that he kicked out a lot of the older generals, guys like Edward Braddock, that didn't understand the type of strategies that would be needed in order to defeat the enemy here in North America. He brings in lots of younger but more effective generals to get the job done. By 1758, under the leadership of William Pitt, the British had regained control of many key points in the Ohio River Valley, especially Fort Duquesne. As soon as they capture Fort Duquesne, it becomes a British possession once again. They named it Fort Pitt in honor of William Pitt. And ready for this? It's also on the site of the city of Pittsburgh, also named for William Pitt. So it all connects here in U.S. history. All right, so let's talk about the end of the war here in North America. How does the French and Indian War end? The British now have sent lots of troops into the colonies to fight against the French. They also are allied with the Iroquois Confederacy, who prefer British rule to French rule, fighting against the much smaller French forces and their Native American allies. And they're able to push the French all the way back up north, and pretty soon they're knocking on the doors of the largest French settlement here in the New World, and that's the city of Quebec. So the Battle of Quebec was a really, really interesting one because Quebec sits high up on these cliffs that overlook the St. Lawrence River, so you can't really attack them from the water. And they're obviously well fortified on the backside of the city with these large plains leading up to the city called the Plains of Abraham. In one of the most stunning and courageous ambushes in military history, the British, led by General James Wolfe, decide that overnight they're going to scale the cliffs outside the city. They bring like 2 or 3 cannons up the cliffs with them, which is pretty impressive without any modern technology. And once they get to the top, they set up their vantage point there on the Plains of Abraham, and they go knocking on the door of the French city of Quebec. French General Montcalm wakes up to find the British outside the city in the Plains of Abraham. In fear of losing any more advantages from his fortified town, he decides to attack them straight away. The British and the French clash in the Plains of Abraham. The British win the battle. Quebec is now theirs, and they are victorious over the French here in the New World. The war between France and England officially ends all around the globe in the year 1763. 1763 sees the signing of the treaty known as the Peace of Paris. And in this treaty, the war spoils are divided up between the English and the French, and then also Spain, who gets involved at the end. And basically what happens in North America and what happens in U.S. history you can see here in this map. And the most important thing to remember here, as you look at the map, is that France pretty much now has no territory in North America except for New Orleans, Louisiana. England gets pretty much everything northeast of the Mississippi River. All right, Spain gets their claims in the western part. And this is how the French and Indian War ends, and these are the results of the French and Indian War. Now, things weren't all rosy in the colonies, though, because now you have the British, who have just fought a very expensive war to defeat the French in North America. You have the colonists, who now feel like they should be able to settle in all these places because many of them were involved in the fighting too. And as you'll see here in the next episode of U.S. History with Mr. Peterson, lots of conflict emerges between the British and their colonists. I wonder what could happen. We'll see you next time. Whew, that was a doozy. We did the whole French Indian War in one episode. Nuts. That's crazy. Hey, if you got value from that though, why don't you think about liking or subscribing? Even turn on notifications and be always learning with us here at Kingdom Lyceum. See you later.